Welcome to the ClassicalU podcast. I'm Jesse Hake. I'm the director at ClassicalU. ClassicalU is a subsidiary of Classical Academic Press, a curriculum and monograph publishing company. At ClassicalU, we provide training for teachers and parents interested in learning more about classical education, how to deliver this method in your classrooms, in your homes. I mostly spend time talking with presenters and live learning event guests, and we look forward to sharing more with you as you tune in. Thank you. David, it's great to have you here working with us this week, recording a new course for ClassicalU. It's been fun to get to know you. You're 6 years at Coram Deo Academy, and your story coming into classical Christian education, providing leadership and ideas for assessing the health of schools, moving schools out of the early stages where you can hit stagnation, and moving schools into stages of thriving and growth. I would love to get to ask you some questions about your own story, how you came into classical education, learn a little more about your graduate work and some of the background to the content that you're sharing in the course that you're recording with us. Why don't we start out with a little bit about how you came to know of classical education?
Yeah. Well, Jesse, it's great to be here. I know I landed last night in Harrisburg, and then this morning, which I've never been to, I got to go to Pittsburgh this year for the first time.
Yeah,
and
ACCS conference was here.
Yeah, I often use George Grant's Stand Fast app, and he has a Christian almanac, and I told you this in the car, that what George Grant does, he said, this is what happened today in history, and this day in history on the day that we're recording was I think it was in the 1820s, the first ever opinion poll used in politics to see the approval rating for a president. It was the person that they were getting the polling on was Andrew Jackson. And guess where it was done? Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
You've taught me something about my own city.
That's I told awesome. You we were both going to be like charismatic by the end of the day. So.
Yeah, clearly the stars are aligning. I mean, that's the standard now of American political life. And it was invented here in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
There you go. You guys are
Thank
on the
you,
map.
George Grant.
Yes. So I got into, did you ask how I got into classical Christian education?
How did you learn about classical Christian education?
Yeah, the quick and dirty would be I became a Christian in college and just got caught up in the claims of the gospel and wanted to submit my life to Christ. And I said, I'll do whatever you want. I thought I maybe wanted to be a missionary or a pastor, but I really just loved school. So I had been a college athlete, so I loved going to class and going to practice. And so when I graduated as a new believer, I thought, well, I'll just keep going to practice and going to class. So I was a teacher coach, having been a student athlete, but I was really eager to share the gospel. So I bought a box of a book by a gentleman named John Piper. So I have a daughter named Piper, named after an old Baptist preacher. But I bought a box of Don't Waste Your Life copies, and I'd give them to these 7th and 8th grade boys and girls. And I'm still excited about the idea of making my life count for eternity. And so I was teaching Spanish in a public middle school and coaching. And honestly, I think looking back, we were talking about Jonathan Edwards today.
Yeah.
John Piper, obviously a big fan of Jonathan Edwards, just really wanting to have a God-entranced vision of all things, including education. And so over time, I would say I got disenchanted with public school because it was basically the factory model of education. And I was teaching Spanish. And so I was teaching 17-year-olds how to count to 10 and say amarillo, rojo.
It wasn't the dream of teaching.
The dream had met reality. And so I enjoyed coaching, and I had begun doing my MDiv at Southern Seminary. And I just was so elevated by studying God's word deeply and theology. And I think that reading Don't Waste Your Life and kind of coming in secondhand contact with Jonathan Edwards, I really started to think differently about kids.
Yeah.
These aren't just like bags to be filled or pencils to be sharpened, but this is divine clay to be molded. And so I would say my anthropology started to develop, and I started to see that teaching Spanish to high schoolers didn't actually help them with Spanish. I had been involved with Young Life and Campus Crusade and saw varying degrees of fruitfulness. But it's actually when I really went deep in Christian education that I saw, oh, wow, this partnership with parents and prioritizing discipleship was so gratifying. So really, it was that first year teaching, handing out Don't Waste Your Life, getting in contact with Jonathan Edwards, and then really starting to think, well, how does the Lordship of Christ apply to education? And for me, that answer for the past 6 years, and hopefully many more, has been in classical. So that was kind of a helter-skelter answer.
No, that's great. You mentioned over lunch the, as an athlete.
And where did we go for lunch? I think it's important the audience knows the name of this restaurant.
This is a restaurant that may be the hardest thing to find by Googling it because the name of the place is Sandwich here in Harrisburg, but they do have good sandwiches. Yes. And straightforward. You can't ever, accuse them of false marketing or something.
The meeting where the owners are like, what should we name it? And they're like, let's just call it Sandwich.
Let's just call it Sandwich. Well, they make good sandwiches. Yep. You mentioned something that struck me, as an athlete, and you talked about in musical training and athletic training, there's a regimen set out, and there's an agreed upon order. And it dawned on you, struck you as you're reading some of the books, Doug Wilson's book, Lost Tools of Learning, and others. Why do we have such a big hang up about this idea, when it comes to forming our minds? Is that, am I remembering that correctly?
Yes,
it struck me as a great way to talk about it.
At lunch, I had just made the observation that my experience, and I have, the gentleman that led me to Christ teaches at a public school, so I want to be as charitable as possible and evaluate things as they really are. But my experience had been in public schools in Indiana that the curriculum was student-centered. I think that was a fair summary, which means that there wasn't a coherent program that was building upon sequentially over time. Yet when I coached athletes and we did weightlifting and strength training, there was a really clear program for multiple years for strength training, for building speed, for, I coached baseball for building arm velocity. It was sequential, it was coherent, it was cohesive, but that wasn't at all how the public school curriculum was so much vocational job training and electives. It was like more pick your own adventure or like a buffet. But it's like that buffet approach, you wouldn't let an Olympic athlete do that. And so I found when I read Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning by Douglas Wilson and then other books, that idea of the grammar stage, the logic stage, the rhetoric stage, there's more ways of describing classical than that. But that really resonated with me because I like to learn and I like to grow. And so I could see a clear course or pathway. Our word for curriculum is, the same as course, right? Yeah. And so I thought, wow, I could see a pathway forward in classical. And so when I moved out of teaching Spanish in public schools to being able to teach different subjects in a classical setting, it was so intensely gratifying immediately. Yeah. Because I thought, oh, this is great. And I remember seeing a quote recently that kids actually want a strict teacher more than they want an affirming, happy, clappy teacher. And I think when kids come to school, everybody loves to learn. Not everybody loves schooling per se in that structure. But I think if you're going to be there, you might as well be in an environment where you know what you're going to get, even if you're kind of an entrepreneurial, innovative type. And so I've just loved the clear vision and the structured pathway that you see in classical schools. There's a coherent, cohesive philosophy that builds sequentially upon one another over time. And anything that has lasting growth is cumulative and it's incremental. And so I see that in math and science and literature and composition. Like, for example, the progym. How do you pronounce that word by the name?
Progymnosmata?
Yeah, progymnosmata. And so I always say it wrong, but just those preliminary exercises that build so sequentially. So when I first got into classical, that was my intro through Institute for Excellence in Writing and Andrew Pudwa's content. And I'm like, why would you teach writing any other way? Like, this is so clear. And there's such good fruit with the students that I worked with. Yeah. And so, I don't know, it's like anything where you have a great first experience, it can hook you quickly. Yeah. I would say that was my experience coming into classical.
Great. What are some words of wisdom for other you kind of surprised yourself in your own story. It sounds like weren't planning on becoming a classical school teacher, but now you've been around the classical Christian renewal for a while. Worked at a couple different levels. I've been head of school for 6 years now. Words of wisdom, what are some things that classical Christian education does well? What are some stumbling blocks? Particularly, I'm thinking practically, imagine the young, like a college student who's graduating thinking, do I want to give a try, teaching at a classical Christian school? What are some things you would say, yeah, these are great reasons, and then these are some things to be aware of?
Yeah. Well, it's funny. We've obviously, as a head of school, I've been doing a lot of hiring in the spring and summer, and the contribution that I try to make to the hiring process. We have a great team at Coram Deo in Indiana, but I try to talk people out of coming to Coram Deo Academy by just naming, like, here would be a good reason not to come. And if you don't like this, you would hate working here. And so different things like that, I think, can be really helpful if God's really calling someone to a classical Christian school. So I would say, one way you might know that you shouldn't work at a classical Christian school is that you don't really want to think that much. And so if you're not you don't need to be like a college professor to be a kindergarten teacher, right? And lower school positions are a little different than upper school. But there is such a love for learning in classical, in the school that I'm at compared to the other 4 schools that I worked, that it's like you notice when you walk in the door how the teachers talk at lunch, just the sort of books that are on their shelf, the books that people have read during their application process. I'm always like, wow, this is so different than when I was just in a regular Christian school and a public school. So you might not want to work at a school like Coram Deo or any of the other great classical Christian schools if you don't like to really go deep in reading and learning. If
your own reading list isn't continually inactive.
I would say the second is classical Christian schools are pretty countercultural. And so there's different ways you could describe classical, but maybe historic or traditional. And so if you love giving kids candy and stickers and like moving their clothespin on a chart, I'd be like, do not come. You will just hate it because you'll think they're so backwards. And so God had been preparing me to have a more timeless approach because I was disenchanted with some of the factory model of education. But then third, if you don't want to get close to parents, do not come to a classical Christian school, because the model, even though it's lived out imperfectly, is that you're partnering with them, that the parents are the primary educators, which if you've had your straw in John Dewey's milkshake, that's a foreign concept to the kind of utopian progressive vision.
Where teachers are almost a kind of savior in a really extreme version of that.
Yeah. Well, that's an interesting thought. I'm going to quote someone. I've not read this book, and I might get in trouble quoting him, but Rushdoony has a book called The Messianic Character of Public Education. And man, I went through a program called Indianapolis Teaching Fellows, which is the same as Teach for America. And man, I thought that I was God's gift to these different schools initially, and had this idea that education had this salvific component to it for these high needs communities. And I was probably a plague on them the first few years I was in education. I had to become disillusioned a little bit before I realized, I'm an instrument. I'm a crooked stick. And if there's anything straight coming from me, it's because of him. So you are right that oftentimes at least the philosophical components can assign a salvific or messianic savior complex to some of the teachers.
So partnering alongside parents is sort of number 3 on something you got to be ready to do. And
those would be, I'm thinking of like younger teachers coming out of because the number of programs that are classical in their bent, even Christian schools, preparing people to teach is really uncommon.
What we were talking earlier today as well about how Jonathan Edwards kind of provides a way into contact with older Christian tradition, and America's a young nation. We're a Protestant nation predominantly, and classical education sometimes looks and feels very old-fashioned, even medieval. You read a lot of Catholic theologians, and what is some common ground as far as kind of the Christian faith between Reformed Baptists, Presbyterian, in terms of things that we share, with Jonathan Edwards being kind of a touchstone for you? It sounds like that was a formative part of your own reading and background.
Well, I would say someone like Charles Spurgeon has probably had a bigger impact, but John Piper has introduced me to Edwards. It's funny because a lot of the parents that enjoy classical probably aren't that theological. They come more from the devotional aspect. They just love to see the love the teachers have for Christ and for their kids. And so I definitely have that in me. My background's in crew and young life. Even though I did my doctorate at a seminary, at the end of the day, I really value classical insofar as it promotes discipleship. Now, I do love theology and intellectual history and ideas. So I would say with Jonathan Edwards, it's so funny. He's one of those backwards Puritans. C.S. Lewis, didn't he talk about that? Like one of the great, what's his comment about the success of Satan with Puritans?
Oh,
I think it's from Screwtape Letters, right?
Yeah, it's ringing a bell. I wouldn't be able to
but it was
exactly. But yeah,
this idea of being
there's a terrible reputation.
Yeah, puritanical and backwards and slaveholding, and rather than illuminating their higher angels, it's kind of like the Scarlet Letter. That sort of approach to
stereotype. That's pretty.
Yeah, but I think Jonathan Edwards. I'm not a historian with Puritanism, but he has this like Puritan devotional piety. Charles Spurgeon had that as well. But the interesting thing about Jonathan Edwards, he's probably the greatest philosopher in American history. And so he's known for that sermon, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. But there's so much more to Edwards. Like in a public school history textbook, that might be all you get with a picture of John Edwards dangling a spider over a fire.
Right.
And I would just say his warm piety as well as his engagement with philosophy and specifically Enlightenment philosophy. And so he really, I think, is not one of those. I feel like as Christians, you either withdraw from culture or go to war with culture. And you have one of those bents rather than just like being a faithful witness. And so I think Edwards, he was a pastor for a long time. He basically gets exiled from his church. He goes and he's a missionary, I think, to the Stockdale Indians. And then for 6 months before he died, I think he was the president of Princeton. And so he's a pastor, a missionary, a professor.
Fully engaged,
just as a faithful witness. And he would engage in the intense debate he was in was over the Lord's Supper and whether you should give it to people who he considered to be unregenerate. And I just love this idea that I'm going to engage with ideas, but also love people. And so Jonathan Edwards, I think every area of his life, he was trying to submit to the glory of God. I'm not a Jonathan Edwards scholar at all, but, I've been helped by what little I've read of him. I have his 2 volumes on my shelf, so that makes me feel like I'll get there eventually.
You have a kind of communion with authors, just having them nearby, and in the books that, I mean, his insights into Augustinian, the well-ordered loves, really bring a whole long history of medieval thought.
Well, I think I'm trying to get at something. I wonder if you can help me here. I don't like this secular sacred divide.
Yeah.
And so how in your mind, how does classical demolish that wall between, I go to my youth group, and I'm engaged in a small group, and I hear a good sermon or engage in the sacraments or whatever. How do you think what we're trying to do in this movement is is lifting the veil, if you will, or tearing down the curtain.
I think it is, absolutely. I mean, I've heard sometimes people in intellectual history or theological history specifically have compared the old, conversation that Christians used to have about reading the pagans to our current kind of split between sacred and secular. So that we kind of, separate the world into two halves. This part doesn't have anything to do with God, and this stuff over here is God's stuff. Of course, all of creation, is God's. All truth is God's truth, and Edwards is a great example of that. And it is partly that that full engagement that you're talking about. But classical Christian education insists. It goes back to that conversation about pagan literature and says, no, we are engaged with all of the good stuff, whether it's coming from pagan sources or explicitly, our own scriptures and our own teachers. We're engaged with all teaching. And that was a stand that wasn't a given. Even those who advocated for it historically, like Basil and, many others, Augustine himself, said, this isn't, it's not all good. Like, you have to be discerning, and you don't take it all with, with a kind of naive, reception from the pagans. But the pagans have a lot to offer. They can teach us, and we need to sit at their feet and learn with a good Christian, a more mature Christian beside us to help us with that discernment process. But that is something then, like, that's an old conversation, an old lesson that classical Christian education advocates for those who were giving that answer around paganism. And I think that actually reinforces the lesson for today that is our own problem, our own hang-up, which is this very strong tendency to think of the world in terms of sacred and secular. And, our church-state, separation of church and state, there's several things that are kind of institutionalized in America that reinforce that for us. But it shows up, even in our kind of attitudes toward Sunday. And, this is when I go to church and, do my God stuff. And then, I go to work, and most of the people sadly in most American workplaces now, be a lot of, you just assume that it would be rude, to in any way sort of represent yourself as serving Christ in your workplace, those kinds of things. So
one of the best compliments I've ever heard about the school that I'm at is someone from a kind of big box Christian school came to the school that I'm at, and just randomly, the dad texted me, here's a list of differences between this school and Coram Deo. Mm-hmm. And one of them was the degree to which Bible was evident in all of the different content areas, which was really encouraging to see. And I think that has a little bit to do with the curriculum, but a lot to do with the sort of people that are attracted to this movement. Is just the Sunday, Wednesday approach to discipling kids is wholly inadequate when you consider Deuteronomy 6, and when I'm sitting and when I'm standing, when I'm walking, when I'm lying down, I'm teaching them the commandments, or Ephesians 6, or which is about raising children in the paideia of the Lord, or even the Great Commission. My MDiv is in Great Commission studies, so if you need to know, if you need advice, you can talk to me. Not really, but I love this idea of we all need help observing what Jesus has commanded us. And there's such normal, ordinary ways to do that. And I just feel like we spend so much time at school that we're missing an opportunity as believers if we don't redeem the schooling aspect. So
that is a great compliment. I mean, what that man said.
Well, I think of even Doug Wilson, who obviously can be quite controversial for some folks in classical. When he started Logos, what he would say is he didn't want two things. Mm-hmm. I don't want it to be a fundamentalist school, and I don't want it to be a college prep school. Mm-hmm. And so, to your point about pagans, is we're going to engage with the philosophic tradition, starting with Plato. And we're going to engage with the literary tradition, starting with Homer. We're just going to track that through history, and I think it just makes people thicker. It gives them more depth and breadth,
Yeah.
and the claims of Christ have more applications. So
yeah, that's a great way to put it. That the claims of Christ have more application when you're engaging with pagan literature. I mean, the fact that your spiritual formation would come in a math class, as well as a Bible class, and even for the pagans, the quadrivium, the mathematics, music, were all about shaping your soul, teaching you to love beauty, harmonizing your soul. Mm-hmm. These kinds of things that we would understand as part of our formation in the image of God. And those, even for the pagans, they understood these disciplines that way, and now we've entirely secularized all these different subject areas, and it is almost inconceivable of us to imagine that math would draw us closer to God.
Yes. Yeah. Well, I think especially if, my bent is kind of to be an achiever, and if I do this, then this will happen. So it's kind of an instrumental approach. Rather than just a approach to which I would enjoy.
Yeah.
And so I this has taken me like the last year. I finished my doctorate last year. So I'd been a student since I was, my whole life.
Yeah.
So I just got addicted to school and reading. I loved reading a syllabus. And I think there's a way in which, at worst, it could be like a man-centered salvation project.
Right.
But if you have this works-based rather than grace-based, or just I can behold the beauty, and I enjoy.
It's contemplative.
I have noticed in the last year I've tried to really be more contemplative with observing the different things that I'm reading, and very slowly I'm like Eustace becoming undragoned. But it is a totally different approach to, you do this so you get the GPA, so you go to the school, so you can get the job.
You have to unlearn that.
It's so painful.
Yeah.
And you need Aslan to scrape it and then throw you in the purifying waters.
And that is another kind of countercultural. So we could go on and on. This is delightful. But I did want to ask about your course, and it is connected to the PhD work that you just mentioned. Describe a little bit about PhD work, and I know your course name is kind of inspired by Doug Wilson's book. You're talking about the lost tools of school leadership, and your PhD work was on the various stages in which schools can kind of get stagnated and stuck. Is that right? Mm-hmm. Can you unpack that for us a little bit?
So the course is entitled Recovering the Lost Tools of Leadership, playing off the book title from Douglas Wilson, Recovering the Lost Tools of Learning. Mm-hmm. And so the idea, my observation has been in the doctoral research that I did an EDD, a Doctorate of Education, that we want to be distinctly classical and Christian in the classroom, but that's not always true in the boardroom. Mm-hmm. And so I read a book during my doctoral program that was about the business forces that reshaped the administration of public schools. So often let me try this on you, Jesse. What's the opposite of classical education? The classical model.
Progressive education.
Okay.
Factory model.
Factory model. There you go. And so how do you think the factory model of education infiltrate? Because schools were classical, but how did they adopt the factory model? How did the barbarians invade? What was their strategy?
Well, you start counting, you start looking for data points, and it's all about, just a kind of numeric evaluation of how time is being used, the results, and what are the various ways to quantify results. And
exactly. So Frederick Taylor and his principles of scientific management, which were all about eliminating cost and maximizing output from the minimum number of inputs. So it's standardization, centralization, and bureaucratization. That's how the factory worked. And you didn't need high-skilled labor. You needed people who could be efficient.
Yeah.
And
just
so
punch the right tickets in the right way.
Yeah. And so I read this book on the impact of Taylorism on schools, and it just blew my mind. one of the impacts of scientific management, which was not just in factories, like it was all the rage in, it's like tiny houses or whatever, these different phenomena from one industry that that gain consensus in the court of public opinion. And so scientific principles of scientific management of becoming more efficient and controlling your life with a stopwatch were really popular in the first half of the 20th century. And they were especially popular with guys like Carnegie and Rockefeller and Vanderbilt, who Carnegie, for example, started the Teachers Pension Fund, which if you were an administrator in higher education and you needed some money, all you had to do is not be sectarian. And so if you were a Southern Baptist denominational school, but you could get a lot of money if you weren't.
There's this pressure now.
There's this pressure now, and most people gave in. And so the history of education, which is documented well in George Marsden's book, The Soul of the American University, is a lot of, you're going from established Protestantism to established unbelief. How did it happen? And I would say the influence of Taylorism, one, so these principles of scientific management where you can only judge outputs based upon a factory rubric of outputs, but also Carnegie, for example, he hated Latin and Greek. And so if you're in a board meeting, like an important meeting where you're reviewing numbers and seeing how things are going and you're checking the state of the quality of what's going on, he thought that classical learning produced a distaste for practical affairs. And so why would we read the Odyssey when we have workforce development issues? So Carnegie was thinking about the next 20 years, not the next 200 years. And the need at the time, not the ultimate need, but the immediate need was workforce development. They needed people to work in the factories. And so progressively, teachers' unions were disincentivizing headmasters from being statesmen and headmasters, but becoming business managers. So one of the things I did was I looked at the administrative courses offered by Columbia University. And it was so funny that they had so few administrative classes in maybe the 1920s, and then by the 1930s, it's like there's 15 different courses you can take to being an administrator. So it's all about efficiency and getting the trains to run on time, but it's not about the intellectual life. And so, again, I think there's this, parents still do this today. People do this to me today that, and I'm in the Midwest, which is a little more blue collar and practical, but there's nothing more practical than ideas. Ideas are like the winds blowing in the sails that it's going to affect things eventually. And so, we don't want to be aloof and disconnected from the day-to-day, but my research is trying to create immunity from what happened to our country 100 years ago. The progressive, I've been influenced by David Goodwin, who always says the supply lines of education have been controlled by the progressives for more than a century. And it's just, you don't have to do that much research to verify that that's mostly generally true. And so I love this idea that a classical Christian philosophy of education should be complemented by a classical Christian philosophy of leadership. And so I think that boardrooms giving in to pragmatism means that to be a headmaster, who cares if you have a PhD or you are a master of certain ancient languages? We want you to have an MBA. And so we don't want you to be a professional when it comes to philosophy or theology or pastoral ministry. We want you to be someone who's good with facilities, finances, and fundraising. And this is, think of by and large, what's a college president? Right. They're a fundraiser. Gone are the days of people like Hutchins, who was at University of Chicago, I believe, and worked with Adler on the Great Books Project. The idea of the intellectual statesman is no longer in vogue. And so I just love that idea of, there's so many different aspects of leadership for boards, for trustees, for headmasters. And there's no like archetypical person that should be in that role. But I would hope that as this movement continues to expand, these should be people that love the ideas, and they're thick and they're weighed down and anchored by the scriptures first and foremost, but they live within a tradition, and they give the democracy of the dead a vote. And so my course is much more practical than the answer that I just gave you. But that gives you some backdrop for the need that I think there's a really short tenure among headmasters in classical Christian schools. There's high turnover among boards, and we really want to see both the longevity, the satisfaction, and the effectiveness of headmasters increase in the years to come. So those are just a few examples of ideas that motivated the course.
Yep. Thank you. You mentioned to me just, telling your own personal story about listening to Keith Nick's course, which is our one course right now on this topic of school leadership, kind of on repeat play back when we had an app with ClassicalU. But how would you answer the question of how your course? Well, let me ask you two questions, actually. What are some of the standouts?
I hope I remember both of them.
Well, what are some of the standouts to you? I can repeat the second one. Standouts to you from Keith's course. What was helpful to you as a young headmaster, 6 years ago?
Yeah, I was cleaning the school at that time. And so the school that I've led has since tripled in size over the past 5 years, doubled the number of employees. I point back to lessons in that course a lot. To be quite frank, I had no idea what I was doing. And so he gave me categories. I would say, I think I almost remember them: vision, strategy, finance, board, culture, and talent. See, that's how many times I've watched it. I think those are his 6 categories. And so he gave me kind of a lattice work or a mental model to start that I've since kind of built upon and modified names and developed my own. So he is a great, if you're a new headmaster or thinking about applying for the role and it's you don't really fully understand what a head of school is or what's the difference between a head of school and a headmaster, I think Keith's course is a really good, and they're like 6 30-minute videos. So it's not, it's very accessible content that's extremely practical. So I think he's good. His background being in business and ministry and then coming into education, he's good at not getting too lost in the ideas and being really practical and knowing his audience. So I've been tremendously helped by him.
And then the second question I had in mind was just how does your course complement, build on some of that, and what's different? Yeah,
so it's probably 3 times the length. And so if, and my doctorate of education is in leadership. So if you want to learn some of the more academic or intellectual load-bearing ideas behind the things that he's saying, which he could also do as well, and does through the Gordon program, I would say I seek to imitate him in providing concrete tools that you can apply. So I introduce 4 tools of leadership, which are producing and teaching and learning, integrating and marketing and admissions, entrepreneuring and fundraising and facilities, and in any list of 4 things, I always forget one. So there's a 4th one that I didn't mention. But I would say it's trying to imitate him in being practical and giving concrete tools. But I'm giving 6 case studies. So I did a year-long case study of 6 different schools along the continuum of the school life cycle.
Yep.
One of them is a brand new school with about 20 students, and one of them is more than 20 years old with more than 500 students. So I do a deep dive for about 30, 40 minutes on each of those schools and apply the mental model that I introduced. So it is meant to be academic to a degree and give you some thinking lenses through which you can see, but it's also giving you stories and quotes and testimonials from these different schools. So I hope it's helpful to people.
Yep. Thank you. What would be the next step for yourself in terms of your school? What are some of your upcoming goals and objectives that you're excited about?
Yeah, our school is in that really challenging yet really rewarding phase where you add the high school grades.
Yep.
And so that has been our theme for the coming years is all in, which is not so much about like, come on, be committed, push your chips in, but it's more acknowledging this idea in order to finish our course, finish what we've started, and I'm going to be like Sayers here for a moment. Root, shoot, and fruit, grammar, logic, rhetoric, finish what we've started. I think the way you do that is you align. So it's less about a level of commitment and more about our head, heart, and hands being in alignment. I always use the image of geese flying in V formation. Because leadership is a team sport, I like that image of distributed leadership for aerodynamic purposes. So you kind of switch who's in charge of the geese flying in V formation. You honk at one another in low visibility conditions as kind of a GPS or navigation system. And so the thing that I'm really excited about is our school, which I would say is an adolescence, where you're figuring out your identity and there's competing agendas, just getting, I'd say over the next 2-3 years, getting a lot of clarity about who God has called us to be in the Midwest. And I'd love to see Coram Deo Academy long past my time at Coram Deo, which I hope to be a long time, be an established lighthouse type classical Christian school in the Midwest, which doesn't have a ton of traction compared to say the Southeast. So I'm really excited. We moved into a new building last year, and so just filling that building with students in upper school and lower school. We are continuing to add new faculty over the next few years with growing enrollment. So just seeing the sorts of people that God brings, the sorts of families that God brings is really exciting and encouraging too.
That's great. Well, thank you so much. Thanks for sharing with us. Look forward to sharing your course, and your course will also be in a book format, which we're very excited about. So 2 different ways you can take advantage of and learn from David and his insights into school leadership.
Thanks, Jesse. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much for listening to the ClassicalU podcast. Please do check out our website, ClassicalU.com, and our teacher magazine, Altum. We hope you've enjoyed these conversations with presenters and live learning event hosts with ClassicalU.